We are reading from Media Control by Noam Chomsky. The chapter is Engineering Opinion. It is also necessary to whip up the population in support of foreign adventures. Usually, the population is pacifist, just like they were during the First World War. The public sees no reason to get involved in foreign adventures, killing, and torture, so you have to whip them up. And to whip them up, you have to frighten them. Barnes himself had an important achievement in this respect. He was the person who ran the public relations campaign for the United Fruit Company in 1954. When the United States moved in to overthrow the capitalist democratic government of Guatemala and installed a murderous death squad society which remains that way to the present day with constant infusions of US aid to prevent in more than empty from democratic deviations. It's necessary to constantly ram through domestic programs which the public is opposed to because there is no reason for the public to be in favor of domestic programs that are harmful to them. This too takes extensive propaganda. We have seen a lot of these in the last 10 years. The Reagan programs were overwhelmingly the Reagan programs were overwhelmingly unpopular. Voters in 1984, Reagan landslide by about 3 to 2, hoped that his policies would not be enacted. If you take particular programs like armaments, cutting back on social spending, etc., almost every one of them was overwhelmingly opposed by the public. But as long as people are marginalized and distracted and have no way to organize or articulate their sentiments or even know that others have these sentiments, people who said that they prefer social spending to military spending, who gave that answer on polls as people overwhelmingly did assumed that they were the only people with that crazy idea in their heads. They never heard it from anywhere else. Nobody is supposed to think that. Therefore, if you do think it and you answer it in a poll, you just assume that you are sort of weird. Since there is no way to get together with other people who share or reinforce that view and help you articulate it, you feel like an oddity, an oddball. So you just stay on the side and you don't pay any attention to what's going on. You look at something else like the Super Bowl. To a certain extent, then that ideal was achieved and but never completely. There are institutions which it has as yet been impossible to destroy. The churches, for example, still exist. A large part of the dissident activity in United States come out of the churches for the simple reason that they are there. So when you go to a European country and give a political talk, it may very likely to be in the Union Hall. Here that won't happen because unions first of all barely exist, and if they do exist, they are not political organizations. But the churches do exist, and therefore you often give a talk in a church. Central American solidarity work mostly grew out of the churches, mainly because they exist. The bewildered herd never gets properly tamed, so this is a constant battle. In the 1930s, they arose again and were put down. In 1960s, there was another wave of dissidents. There was a name for that. It was called by the specialized class the crisis of democracy. It was called by the specialized class as the crisis of democracy. Democracy was regarded as entering into a crisis in the 1960s. The crisis was the large segments of the population were becoming organized and active and trying to participate in the political arena. Here, we come back to these two conceptions of democracy. By the dictionary definition, that's an advance in a democracy. By the prevailing conception, that's a problem, a crisis that has to be overcome. The population has to be driven back to the apathy, obedience, and passivity that is their proper state. We therefore have to do something to overcome the crisis. Efforts were made to achieve that. It hasn't worked. The crisis of democracy is still alive and well. fortunately, but not very effective in changing policy. But it is effective in changing opinion, contrary to what a lot of people believe. Great efforts were made after the 1960s to try to reverse and overcome this malady. One aspect of the malady actually got a technical name. It was called the Vietnam Syndrome. The Vietnam Syndrome, a term that began to come up around 1970, has actually been defined on occasion. The Reaganite intellectual Normal Porridge defined it as the sickly inhibitions against the use of military force. There were these sickly inhibitions against violence on the part of a large part of the public. People just didn't understand why we should go around torturing people and killing people and carpet bombing them. It's very dangerous for a population to be overcome by these sickly inhibitions, as Goebbels understood, because then there is a limit on foreign adventures. It's necessary as the Washington Post put it rather proudly during the Gulf War hysteria, to instill in people a respect for martial value. That's important. If you want to have a violent society that uses force around the world to achieve the ends of its own domestic elite, it's necessary to have a proper appreciation of the martial values and none of these sickly inhibitions about using violence. So that's the Vietnam syndrome. It's necessary to overcome that. One, representation as a reality. That will be our next chapter.